Just 4 words. "There you go again." Jimmy Carter's face instantly changed. 70 million Americans held their breath watching TV. That moment showed how an actor could become president. The stage lights of Cleveland's Music Hall illuminated what would become one of the most pivotal moments in American political history on the evening of October 28, 1980. The air was electric with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. 70 million Americans sat glued to their television screens, waiting to witness a confrontation that would determine the fate of the nation. Outside the hall, protesters chanted slogans while police barriers held back crowds of supporters from both campaigns. Inside, the venue buzzed with nervous energy. Television crews from every major network had descended on Cleveland, their cameras and cables snaking across the floor like electronic tentacles, reaching into every corner of American consciousness. 2 men stepped onto that stage, representing not just different political parties, but entirely different visions for America's future. One was Jimmy Carter, the 56-year-old incumbent president who had spent 4 grueling years in the White House, battling economic crisis, energy shortages, and international humiliation. His face was etched with the stress of leadership during America's darkest domestic hours since the Great Depression. The other was Ronald Wilson Reagan, 69 years old, the former Hollywood actor turned politician who many dismissed as too old, too simplistic, too out of touch with the complexities of governing a superpower. His silver hair caught the studio lights as he walked with the confident stride of a man who had spent 40 years commanding audiences. Carter approached the podium with the determined gait of a man who knew this was his last chance. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes held a steely resolve that said, "I'm going to destroy this old actor tonight." The media had been writing Reagan off for months, calling him a lightweight, a has-been from Hollywood who didn't understand the nuances of foreign policy or economic theory. The Washington Post had run a scathing editorial just days before, titled "The Amateur Hour." The New York Times had questioned whether Reagan had the intellectual capacity for the presidency. Even some Republicans worried privately that their nominee might embarrass himself on national television. But Reagan stepped to his position with the easy grace of a man who had stood before cameras and crowds for decades. There was something different about him tonight, something the pollsters and pundits hadn't accounted for. Beneath that affable exterior was a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he didn't know it. His campaign manager had been nervous all week, knowing that one stumble, one senior moment, one confused answer could doom their chances. Reagan's age was constantly scrutinized, every pause analyzed for signs of mental decline. Tonight would either confirm those fears or put them to rest forever. But nobody in that hall could have predicted what would unfold in the next 90 minutes. The stakes couldn't have been higher. America was reeling from double-digit inflation, soaring unemployment, and the ongoing humiliation of American hostages held captive in Iran for nearly a year. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, making America look weak on the world stage. Long gas lines snaked around city blocks, while Americans wondered if their country's best days were behind them. This wasn't just a debate between 2 candidates. This was a battle for the soul of America itself. In living rooms across the country, families gathered around their television sets with the same sense of anticipation they might feel watching the Super Bowl. In a bar in Detroit, unemployed auto workers nursed their beers and waited to hear which candidate understood their pain. In a retirement home in Florida, elderly Americans wondered who would protect their Social Security. In suburban kitchens from coast to coast, mothers struggling with grocery bills that seemed to double every month hoped someone would offer real solutions, not just political promises. Jimmy Carter stood behind his podium, adjusting his microphone with the meticulous care that had defined his presidency. Here was a man who read every briefing book cover to cover, who insisted on personally approving the White House tennis court schedule, who brought an engineer's precision to every decision. The 39th President of the United States had risen from a peanut farm in Plains, Georgia, to the highest office in the land through sheer determination and moral conviction. He was a born-again Christian who taught Sunday school, a Naval Academy graduate who had served on nuclear submarines, a details-oriented leader who believed that good governance came from hard work and careful analysis. Carter's preparation for this debate had been exhaustive. For weeks, his team had drilled him on every possible question, every potential attack line, every weakness in Reagan's record. They had created a mock-up of the debate stage in the White House, complete with podiums and cameras, where Carter practiced his answers until he could recite them in his sleep. Tonight, Carter was loaded for bear. His briefing books were thick with statistics, economic projections, and foreign policy minutiae. His strategy was clear. Expose Reagan as an out-of-touch Hollywood actor who didn't understand the complexities of governing. Show America that leadership required more than charm and one-liners. His advisors had identified what they saw as Reagan's fatal weakness, his tendency to oversimplify complex issues. They believed that if they could get Reagan talking about policy details, he would reveal himself as the lightweight they knew him to be. Ronald Reagan checked his own microphone with the casual ease of a man who had spent decades performing. But this wasn't performance. This was something deeper. At 69, Reagan brought a lifetime of experience that his critics consistently underestimated. Born in Illinois, raised during the Depression, Reagan understood hardship in a way that resonated with ordinary Americans. His father was an alcoholic shoe salesman. His family moved constantly, and young Dutch Reagan learned early that sometimes you had to create your own hope when the world seemed dark. Hollywood had taught him timing, presence, and how to connect with an audience. 8 years as governor of California had taught him how to lead, how to negotiate, and how to turn conservative principles into practical policies that actually worked. But perhaps most importantly, Reagan possessed something that couldn't be taught or briefed, an unshakable faith in America and its people. Reagan's own preparation had been characteristically different from Carter's. Where Carter memorized statistics, Reagan focused on themes. Where Carter prepared detailed rebuttals to specific attacks, Reagan worked on projecting optimism and confidence. His advisors knew that Americans didn't want a professor. They wanted a leader. The night before the debate, Reagan had spent the evening at his hotel, not cramming policy papers, but watching old movies with Nancy and sharing stories with his closest friends. "I'm not going to try to out-Carter Carter," he had told his campaign manager. "I'm going to be Ronald Reagan." As moderator Howard K. Smith introduced the ground rules, you could see the contrast immediately. Carter sat rigid, intense, ready to pounce with facts and figures. Reagan leaned back slightly, that famous half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth, looking for all the world like a man about to share a good story with old friends. The television audience could sense it, too. In homes across America, viewers noticed the body language, the facial expressions, the subtle but unmistakable differences in how the two men carried themselves. Carter looked like a man preparing for battle. Reagan looked like a man preparing for a conversation. What happened next would shock the political establishment to its core. The debate began with questions about domestic policy, and Carter immediately went on the attack. This was his element, policy details, government programs, legislative intricacies. He had spent 4 years immersed in every aspect of federal governance. Carter leaned forward, his voice sharp and confident. Governor Reagan, your position on Medicare is well documented. You opposed Medicare. You opposed Social Security expansion. You've called for major cuts in federal programs that protect our seniors. How can you claim to represent the interests of older Americans? It was a calculated strike, designed to paint Reagan as an extremist who would gut the safety net that millions of Americans depended on. Carter's team had prepared this attack carefully, knowing that senior citizens were a crucial voting bloc. They had polling data showing that this line of attack could be devastating to Reagan's chances. In retirement homes across Florida, elderly viewers leaned forward in their chairs. This was personal to them. Their monthly checks, their health care, their dignity in old age hung in the balance. Reagan's response was immediate and disarming. Instead of getting defensive or launching into a detailed policy explanation, he simply smiled and shook his head with the bemused expression of a grandfather correcting a well-meaning but mistaken grandchild. His voice was warm and conversational. Well, President Carter, I support Medicare and Social Security. I believe we can make them stronger, not weaker. America's seniors deserve better health care and more secure retirement, not less. The answer was simple, direct, and completely undermined Carter's attack. No wonky policy details, no defensive protests, just a clear statement that connected with what people actually cared about. Carter looked slightly thrown. He had expected Reagan to either stumble through a complex defense or to get flustered by the aggressive opening. Instead, the old actor had deflected the attack with grace and pivoted to a positive message. In the control room, network executives watched the real-time polling numbers flash across their screens. Reagan's favorability ratings had actually increased after Carter's attack, not the result anyone had predicted. But Carter was just getting started. He hadn't played his trump card yet. The president shuffled through his notes, looking for the next line of attack. His advisors had prepared him for this moment, loading him with statistics and quotes that would expose Reagan's supposed extremism. Carter's confidence began to return as he found his rhythm, launching into the kind of detailed policy discussion that he believed would highlight the differences between a serious president and a Hollywood pretender. As the debate progressed, Carter became increasingly aggressive, rattling off statistics and government figures with the rapid-fire delivery of a policy wonk in his element. Carter spoke faster now, almost lecturing. Governor Reagan's proposed tax cuts would increase the federal deficit by $130 billion, according to independent economic analysis. This is fiscally irresponsible and would require massive cuts in programs that working families depend on. His supply-side economics theory is untested and dangerous. The president pulled out charts and graphs, waving them for emphasis as he cited Congressional Budget Office projections and Treasury Department analyses. This was Carter at his most professorial, demonstrating his command of complex fiscal policy with the kind of detailed knowledge that had impressed Washington insiders throughout his presidency. Carter was in professor mode now, throwing around numbers and economic theories like weapons. This was supposed to be his knockout punch. Show America that Reagan was a dreamer with dangerous ideas who didn't understand basic economics. But something was stirring in Reagan. You could see it in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Here was a man who had been governor of the nation's largest state, who had battled economic challenges before, being lectured about fiscal responsibility by the president, who had given America its worst economic performance since the 1930s. Reagan's voice began to carry an edge. President Carter, you've been in charge of this economy for 4 years. In that time, we've seen inflation hit 20%, unemployment reach levels we haven't seen since the Depression, and interest rates that are crushing small businesses and families trying to buy homes. Reagan paused, letting that sink in before continuing with building intensity. You can talk about economic theory all you want, but the American people are living with the results of your policies every day. Across America, viewers nodded in recognition. In Detroit, where unemployment had reached devastating levels, families saw their struggles acknowledged. In small towns where Main Street businesses were closing due to crushing interest rates, entrepreneurs felt heard for the first time in years. The audience could feel the energy shifting. This wasn't the doddering old actor that Carter's team had prepared for. This was a man who had successfully governed 25 million Californians and wasn't about to be lectured by someone whose economic record spoke for itself. But Carter wasn't backing down. If anything, he doubled down on his attack strategy, believing that more facts, more statistics, more detailed policy analysis would eventually overwhelm Reagan's simple appeals. His voice rose, more aggressive. Governor Reagan, you said, and I quote, "Recession is when your neighbor loses his job. Depression is when you lose yours. Recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his." This flippant attitude toward economic suffering shows how out of touch you are with working families. Carter thought he had found the perfect quote to show Reagan's callousness. His research team had dug up the line from a campaign speech, and they were sure it would backfire on the former governor. The quote had been taken slightly out of context, but Carter's team believed it would serve their purpose of painting Reagan as insensitive to economic hardship. That's when Reagan's famous smile began to spread across his face. Reagan tilted his head slightly, that bemused expression returning to his face. But this time, there was steel behind the smile. He had heard enough distortion, enough mischaracterization, enough political theater. It was time to remind America what real leadership looked like. Reagan's voice was calm but firm. "There you go again." 4 words. Just 4 simple words, delivered with the perfect timing of a man who had spent decades understanding how to connect with an audience. The studio fell silent. Carter's mouth opened slightly, confusion flickering across his face. He hadn't expected this response. Where was the defensive explanation? Where was the complex policy rebuttal? In television control rooms across the country, directors scrambled to get the best camera angle of both men. They sensed they were witnessing something historic, something that would be replayed for decades to come. Reagan continued, his voice gaining strength. "President Carter, you're doing exactly what you've done throughout this campaign. You're taking my words out of context and misrepresenting my positions." Reagan turned slightly, addressing not just Carter, but speaking directly to the camera, and through it, to the 70 million Americans watching at home. "What I was saying is that we need to have compassion for working families who are struggling. When someone loses their job, it's not a statistic, it's a personal tragedy. And the question isn't whether we care about these families, but whether the policies of this administration are helping them or hurting them." The transformation was remarkable. In the space of 30 seconds, Reagan had shifted from being on the defensive to taking control of the entire debate. Carter, who had entered the night confident in his preparation and his command of policy details, suddenly found himself scrambling for a response. His carefully prepared attack lines seemed suddenly irrelevant. The statistics he had memorized felt cold and distant compared to Reagan's warm, personal appeal. For the first time in the debate, Carter looked unsure of himself, glancing down at his notes as if searching for a lifeline. But Reagan wasn't finished. The knockout punch was still coming. Reagan stepped slightly closer to his microphone, his voice taking on the warm but authoritative tone that had made him one of America's most beloved governors. The president talks about my economic theories being dangerous. Let me ask you something. Is it dangerous to want to cut taxes so families can keep more of what they earn? Is it dangerous to want to reduce regulations that are strangling small businesses? Is it dangerous to believe that America's economy grows when we trust the American people instead of trusting government bureaucrats? Each question hit like a hammer blow, but Reagan wasn't done. He was building to something that would resonate long after the cameras stopped rolling. Reagan moved away from his podium slightly, using the movement to command attention the way he had learned during his acting days. But this wasn't performance. This was conviction born from years of experience and a deep love for his country. I want to ask you, the American people, a simple question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Simple, direct, impossible to evade with statistics or policy papers. Reagan's voice built with passion. Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe? That we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? Each question was a dagger to Carter's re-election hopes because everyone watching knew the answers. Inflation was crushing family budgets. Unemployment was at Depression-era levels. American hostages had been held in Iran for nearly a year, while the administration seemed powerless to act. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence while America appeared weak and indecisive. Across the country, Americans found themselves nodding along with Reagan's questions. In suburban living rooms, families looked at each other and realized they couldn't answer yes to any of those questions. The simple truth of Reagan's inquiry cut through all of Carter's complex explanations and statistical analyses. Carter tried desperately to regain control, his voice taking on a defensive edge that everyone could hear. He spoke rapidly, almost desperately. Governor Reagan, many of the problems we face today are inherited from previous administrations. The energy crisis, inflation, these are global problems that require careful, thoughtful solutions. It was exactly the wrong response, a president making excuses, blaming others, offering more of the same careful management that had characterized his entire term. Reagan responded with that same gentle but devastating smile. There you go again, Mr. President. It's always someone else's fault. The audience stirred. You could feel the energy in the room shifting dramatically. Carter, who had entered the debate as the experienced incumbent ready to demolish a Hollywood lightweight, was being systematically dismantled by a man who understood something Carter never had. How to connect with the American people's hearts, not just their minds. What happened next would be talked about for decades. When the debate ended, the studio audience erupted in sustained applause. Carter extended his hand to shake Reagan's, but you could see the defeat in his eyes. His carefully prepared attack strategy had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. Backstage, the contrast was stark. Carter's campaign team huddled in frantic, whispered conversations. "How did an old actor do this to us?" one aide muttered. "We had all the facts, all the statistics, all the policy details." Meanwhile, Reagan walked calmly to where Nancy was waiting, that famous half-smile still playing at his lips. "How did it go, honey?" Nancy asked, though she already knew from the look on his face. "I think we're going to win, sweetheart," Reagan replied simply. He was right. The polling shift was immediate and dramatic. Pre-debate polls showed Carter at 47% and Reagan at 39%. Post-debate polls showed Reagan at 52% and Carter at 41%. The Election Day result 2 weeks later was Reagan 51%, Carter 41%. But the numbers only told part of the story. What really happened that night was that America remembered what leadership looked like. But the impact went far beyond just one election. What Carter never understood, and what the political establishment missed, was that Reagan's power didn't come from policy papers or government experience. It came from something much deeper, an unshakable belief in the American people and their capacity for greatness. Carter approached problems like an engineer, with technical solutions and complex systems. Reagan approached them like a leader, with vision, confidence, and an ability to inspire others to believe in themselves. The "there you go again" moment became legendary not because it was clever, but because it perfectly captured the difference between political gamesmanship and authentic leadership. While Carter was trying to score points with gotcha quotes and statistical bombardments, Reagan was speaking directly to the concerns and hopes of ordinary Americans. Carter's mistake was thinking the debate was about proving he was smarter than Reagan. Reagan's genius was knowing the debate was about proving he understood the American people better than Carter did. That October night in Cleveland taught America several timeless lessons about leadership. Authenticity trumps preparation. Carter had prepared for weeks, memorizing statistics and policy positions. Reagan prepared by understanding what Americans were actually worried about. Connection matters more than correction. When Carter attacked him with misquoted statements, Reagan didn't get bogged down in detailed rebuttals. He simply connected with the audience's common sense. Optimism is more powerful than expertise. Carter presented himself as the experienced technocrat who understood complex problems. Reagan presented himself as someone who believed America's best days were ahead. Simple questions can be more devastating than complex arguments. "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" was devastating precisely because it was so simple. And the ripple effects of that debate are still being felt today. Reagan's debate performance didn't just win him the presidency. It changed American politics forever. The "are you better off" question became the gold standard for challenging incumbents. Every subsequent presidential campaign has echoed themes that Reagan first articulated that night. But more importantly, Reagan's victory launched what historians call the Reagan Revolution, a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about the relationship between government and individual freedom. His optimistic conservatism dominated American politics for the next generation. The man who had been dismissed as just an actor became one of the most consequential presidents in American history, leading the country through economic recovery, helping to end the Cold War, and restoring America's confidence in itself. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of that debate was how it revealed Reagan's fundamental character. When attacked, he didn't attack back. He smiled. When mischaracterized, he didn't get angry. He gently corrected. When faced with hostility, he responded with humor and grace. This wasn't political calculation. This was who Ronald Reagan was. A man who believed that America was fundamentally good, that Americans were fundamentally decent, and that with the right leadership, there was no problem the country couldn't solve. Carter, for all his intelligence and dedication, represented the exhaustion of American liberalism, the belief that experts and technocrats could manage America's decline with careful planning and lowered expectations. Reagan represented something America desperately needed: the belief that America's best days were not behind it, But ahead of it, there you go again. 4 simple words that changed the course of history. Not because they were eloquent or profound, but because they perfectly captured a moment when America was ready to choose hope over fear, optimism over pessimism, leadership over management. The debate that night wasn't really between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. It was between 2 visions of America, one that saw the country as a problem to be managed, and one that saw it as a promise to be fulfilled. America chose the promise. And in making that choice, the country began a journey that would see it emerge from the malaise of the 1970s to become once again what Reagan always believed it could be, a shining city upon a hill, a beacon of freedom and hope for the entire world. If this story moved you, don't miss our other Reagan stories, because this was just the beginning. The tale of how an actor became a president and how a president saved America is just getting started.